In the early morning of November 11, 1918, in an old carriage near Compiègne, a few pen strokes marked the end of years of destruction on the Western Front. This simple act brought an end to a war that claimed the lives of around 9 million men. But who was the last to fall? Let's count the final hours, minutes, and seconds, tracing the fate of those who would never see the end of World War I. In November 1918, the outcome of the war on the Western Front was already decided. The last defensive positions of the German army had been shattered in August. Since then, in an offensive called the 100 Days, the Allies relentlessly pursued the Germans whenever they could. This return to open warfare was extremely costly for everyone, and the losses so close to the end were even more painful. Then, in the early morning of November 11th, when news that the fighting would cease arrived, millions of men breathed a sigh of relief. Only a few hours remained. Let's explore the positions of the various Allied nations as they approached 11 a.m. In the north, the Belgian army, after years of holding positions in the deadly Yser sector, advanced, with units leading the pursuit of the Germans around the city of Ghent. To the south, the British, exhausted by the war, advanced over terrain they hadn't seen since the early days of the war, now marching towards the city of Mons, where they had their first encounter in the summer of 1914. Leading the charge were the cavalry and infantry of the esteemed Canadian Expeditionary Force. Further south, the French army, the main actor of the Great War, advanced towards the German border, crossing devastated lands and liberating thousands of countrymen every day. Among these French armies, the Americans of the Expeditionary Force fought through the Meuse-Argonne. As the morning progressed, tension and anticipation grew. Every passing minute seemed like an eternity for those soldiers who just wanted to see the end of that nightmare. The fight continued, with fierce battles, as the countdown to the ceasefire continued. And in the midst of this chaos, the last lives would be lost, men who never knew that peace was just minutes away. At 11 o'clock, the gunfire finally ceased. Silence fell over the battlefields. The war that consumed millions of lives and caused so much devastation had come to an end. But the memory of the last moments and the last to fall remains, a somber reminder of the high cost of war. Although they spent little time in large numbers on the Western Front, the soldiers' contribution was significant. On the other side of the constantly shifting front lines were about 185 German divisions. These soldiers, hungry, bloodied, and bone-weary, desperately yearned for the end of a war that had claimed millions of lives. And so, as the sun rose around 7 a.m. on November 11th, the Allies, still unaware of the armistice signed hours earlier, planned to continue their advance. But this raises a question. With the war so close to ending, why attack on that day? The answer, simple and tragic, is, why not? The need to push the enemy back, gain advantageous ground, and deplete the opponent's resources was the same as in previous years. Even after the first news of the armistice began to reach the front lines shortly after dawn, the advance plans continued. It's worth remembering that an armistice is a pause in fighting, not a definitive end. Although we know this today, in November 1918, no one was sure that the fighting on the Western Front would not resume. Therefore, as cold as it may seem, the orders to capture a hill or take up position on a ridge in the final moments before the armistice made sense. Unfortunately, like everything in the Great War, these movements came at a cost. Approximately 2,000 men lost their lives on the last day of the war on the Western Front, some tragically close to 11 a.m. With only a few hours remaining, let's head north to the British sector around Mons, where the advance continued. Around 9:30 a.m., the men of the 5th Irish Lancers were on the move, tasked with probing eastward to locate the German rearguard and maintain pressure on the retreating enemy. Among these men was soldier George Edwin Ellison. What do we know about George? He was one of the many soldiers who continued to fight even in the war's final moments. His fate, like that of so many others, was marked by uncertainty and the tension of the last day. As he advanced with his unit, George found himself amidst chaos and anticipation, unaware that peace was only hours away. The suspense grew with each step, each gunshot, until finally, at 11 a.m., silence fell over the battlefields. The war was over, but the cost of those final movements was etched in history, reminding us of the tragedy of war and the price paid by so many until the very last second. Let's take a look at the military records available on Find My Past to learn more about George. Typing in his full name and known details, we find a wide variety of documents. The first one is the 1881 census, which shows George as a 2-year-old boy, the son of a baker, living with a family in Union Court, the old city of York. Born in 1878, George was surprisingly 40 years old in 1918. Further research reveals that George enlisted in the British Army as a regular soldier around 1902, but returned to civilian life in 1911. However, he rejoined the Army, joining the 5th Lancers as a private, with whom he fought in battles such as Mons, Ypres, Loos, and Cambrai, until returning to Mons in 1918. Records show us that he rode through the town square of Mons, being hailed by the local population. After that, Ellison and his comrades advanced northeastward, passing through the lead infantry of the Saskatchewan Canadian Regiment, continuing the pursuit of the enemy. An official report from Squadron C, 5th Lancers, describes the following moments. Two platoons under the command of Lieutenant Biggs headed for Havre Forest, where they encountered resistance with machine gun fire. Another patrol was sent to the northern end of the woods, attempting to reach the canal beyond. This patrol spotted German cyclists and, upon entering the forest, was met with more machine gun fire. Lieutenant Biggs attempted to capture the machine gun, but was unsuccessful. At 9:30, the patrol withdrew from the woods to make way for the infantry. During this final movement, while Ellison and his men moved toward safety, a single shot was fired, hitting George Ellison in the chest and knocking him from his horse. George Ellison, at 40 years old, died there on the outskirts of Mons, an hour and a half before the armistice came into effect. He became the last of nearly 1 million British servicemen to fall under enemy fire in the First World War. The tragedy and tension of these final moments are palpable. Even knowing that the war was about to end, the dangers didn't magically disappear. George Ellison's story is a grim reminder of the human cost of war, especially in the final moments when peace was so close yet still out of reach. Please give a like and subscribe to General Jack's channel to stay updated on more war stories. Almost at the same time George Ellison fell, news of the armistice reached Paris and spread through the city like wildfire. Those who had spent years worrying about the return of their loved ones could finally feel a glimmer of hope. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, the British population also received the news, with an official announcement stating, the armistice was signed at 5 in the morning and hostilities must cease on all fronts at 11 o'clock today. Less than an hour remained. For millions of men, the time between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m. that morning must have seemed like an eternity, especially for those on the front lines of the Allied advance. In the north, the Belgian army, along with the French, advanced through their own territory, liberating a population that had lived under occupation for over 4 years. At 7:16, the leading forces reached the Ghent-Terneuzen Canal, where German machine guns were still active. At 10:42, amidst cheers from the Belgians, who were already celebrating the imminent peace, 3 soldiers advanced towards the canal bank to locate enemy fire. A single burst hit the 3, including Corporal Marcel Turf, 24, a native of Liège, who was shot in the left lung. Despite desperate attempts to save him, Marcel died 3 minutes later, at 10:45, becoming the last Belgian soldier to fall. Almost exactly at the same time, about 160 kilometers away, between the major cities of Sedan and Charleville-Mézières, first-class soldier Augustin Trébuchon, another 40-year-old veteran who survived the infernal battles at the Marne, Somme, and Verdun, was on the move. The anxiety and tension in the final moments before the armistice were palpable. As news of the imminent peace spread, fighting still raged fiercely on various fronts. The Belgian army, trying to liberate as much territory as possible before the ceasefire, faced fierce resistance. Marcel Turf and his comrades, advancing with courage, paid the ultimate price. At the same time, Augustin Trèbuchon, in another sector of the front, was moving towards the enemy, unaware that the war was about to end. Each step, each movement carried the hope of survival and the shadow of death. At 11 o'clock, when the gunfire finally ceased, the silence brought a tragic relief and the realization that the last moments of the war had exacted too high a price. These intertwined stories in the final moments of the First World War highlight the sacrifice and courage of the soldiers who fought until the last second. The human cost was immense, and the price of peace, painfully high. Augustin Trèbuchon, a runner of the 415th Infantry Regiment, had made it to that point with much luck. His role was perilous, carrying messages between headquarters and the front lines. On that day, however, he brought good news. The message he carried informed the men of the 415th that the fighting would stop, and it said, "Je meeting at 11:30 for provisions." Trèbuchon advanced towards the front line under a light rain and temperatures below zero. Despite the cold, he likely had a smile on his face and a word of hope for the comrades he encountered along the way. But moments after reaching the front line, a burst of machine gun fire cut through the air, and Trèbuchon, still holding the message, fell dead. He was the last of over 1 million soldiers to die on the Western Front. Meanwhile, in Paris, 5 minutes after Trèbuchon's death, Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the supreme Allied commander on the Western Front, issued a crucial order. Hostilities will cease on the entire front as of November 11th at 11 o'clock. The Allied troops will not exceed the line reached at that date and time until further orders. Perhaps a minute later, at 10:51, in the area of Mons where George Ellison was killed, the Allies continued to advance cautiously. Everyone knew about the armistice, and most had stopped, unwilling to risk their lives in the final moments. But not everyone had stopped. At the spearhead of the advance, men from the 28th Canadian Infantry, including friends George Price and Art Goodworthy, were clearing houses as they moved through villages beyond Mons, towards the Canal du Centre. What do we know about George Price? Tracing his burial record, we find that he was from Port Williams, Nova Scotia. According to the Canadian census of 1911, he was a farm laborer, living with his parents and sister. His military service record shows that he was enlisted on October 15, 1917, and arrived in France the following February. In September, he was hospitalized due to a gas attack, returning to the front line only in October. As Price and Goodworthy advanced, suspense mounted. Time was running out, peace was so close, yet the war had not ended. Each step forward was a mix of hope and danger. They were so close to the end, but uncertainty still hung in the air, like a constant shadow. These final stories of the First World War show the human cost up to the last moments. The sacrifice of Trèbuchon and Price, as well as many others, highlights the tragedy and courage that marked the minutes before the armistice. The war, even in its final moments, continued to exact its terrible toll. With less than 5 minutes to 11 a.m., George Price, Art Goodworthy, and 3 other soldiers decided, on their own initiative, to cross the canal held by the enemy to clear a final group of miners' cabins. Minutes earlier, they had seen German machine guns firing from there. As they reached the cabins, they began checking them one by one, discovering German soldiers positioning machine guns along a brick wall overlooking the canal. The Germans opened fire immediately, but protected by the brick wall, the Canadians remained unharmed. Knowing they had been discovered and were being flanked, the Germans began to retreat. Price's patrol quickly entered the house from which they thought the original fire was coming, but found that the Germans had gone out the back door when they entered the front. They were about to move forward when a Belgian family, who lived in one of the nearby houses, called out to the Canadians to warn them of the danger. Ignoring the advice, George stepped out onto the street and was immediately shot in the right chest by a German sniper. Dragged into one of the houses and treated by a young Belgian nurse who ran across the street to help, he died a minute later, at 10:58, becoming the last Commonwealth soldier killed in action on the Western Front. At the same moment, 160 kilometers away, north of the infamous battlefield of Verdun, the Americans were also on the move. 10 days earlier, they had finally broken through the German lines in that sector and had been attacking ever since. On the morning of November 11th, advances were still being made in large numbers, including by the doughboys of the 313th Infantry Regiment, known as a Baltimore's Own. Among them was a soldier named Henry Gunther. According to his enlistment card from June 1917, Henry was from Baltimore, Maryland, and worked as an accountant before the war. Researching more about his life, we discovered in the 1900 U.S. Census that Henry's parents were actually born in Germany, adding a powerful and personal layer to his story. As the war drew to a close, the final moments were filled with action and suspense. George Price, with courage and determination, attempted to clear the last enemy cabins, paying with his life in the last minutes before peace. At the same time, Henry Gunther and his American comrades continued to advance, unaware that the armistice was about to be declared. War, even in its final moments, spared no one, and the last actions of Price and Gunther show the sacrifice and courage of soldiers who fought until the last second. The human cost was enormous, and peace, though welcome, came too late for many. Henry Gunther arrived in France and was promoted to supply sergeant, but a letter home criticizing the miserable conditions led to his demotion and transfer to the front lines. He took this demotion very badly, which may have influenced his tragic fate. On the morning of November 11th, Henry and the men of Company A, 313th Regiment, marched with bayonets fixed through thick fog and marshland, towards the small village of Ville-de-Venchemont. It was 9:30 a.m. when the German artillery opened fire, killing some of Henry's comrades. Despite the casualties, they pressed on, reaching their objective and finding cover in a shallow trench, watching the German retreat. Less than 20 minutes remained until the end of the fighting. At 10:44 a.m., a breathless runner reached Gunther's group, bringing news that an armistice had been signed and would come into effect in a few minutes. Ahead of them, 2 German machine guns guarded the road on the outskirts of the village. What went through Henry's mind in that final moment is a mystery, but we know what happened seconds before 11 a.m. Suddenly, Gunther leaped up and charged towards the machine guns. His comrades shouted for him to stop, and even the Germans tried to make him give up. But Henry was determined. He ran straight for the machine guns, ignoring the warning shouts. The Germans, with no choice, opened fire, and Henry Gunther was hit, falling dead just seconds before the armistice came into effect. These final moments were full of suspense and action. Henry, marked by the demotion and the pressure of war, made a final decision that sealed his fate. He was the last American soldier to die in combat in World War I, a tragic sacrifice in the closing moments of a devastating conflict. The German machine gunners stood up and waved, trying to convince Henry to stop and turn around. But Gunther, determined, fired. With no other choice, the Germans retaliated with a burst of 5 shots. One bullet struck Gunther in the left temple, and he fell to the ground. Those present swear that the roar of the artillery ceased at the exact moment his body hit the ground. Henry Gunther, from Baltimore, lost his life literally seconds before the armistice came into effect, earning the sad distinction of being the last Allied soldier to die in combat on the Western Front. He is remembered for this tragic feat, his death symbolizing the final moments of a devastating conflict. Today, there is some controversy over the exact location where Henry Gunther fell. Official records indicate he was killed and buried in an isolated grave at coordinates E332.6N280.6. When overlaid on a trench map from the time, this location can be identified. However, there is a memorial supposedly marking the spot where Henry fell, about 2.4 kilometers away. Perhaps we will never know the exact location. There is one more nation we need to consider when recounting the story of the Western Front on that day: Germany. Approximately 18 miles northwest of where Henry Gunther was killed, north of the town of Stenay, German troops were positioned opposite the men of Company L, 356th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. They had been engaged in fierce fighting all morning, and the regiment's phone lines were cut, leaving them unaware that an armistice was about to take effect. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Thomas from the 19th Uhlans was informed about the armistice, and shortly after 11 a.m., he left his trench to approach the Americans and inquire if the fighting had really ended. Instead of being received, he was shot and died on the spot, officially becoming the last German soldier to be killed in combat on the Western Front. But was he truly the last? Probably not. The popular image of the armistice is that at 11 a.m., all firing ceased immediately, and no further action took place. However, the reality is much less clear. It is true that in most places, there was a mixture of relief and jubilation on both sides, as remarkable scenes captured on the battlefield at that historic moment show. However, in some areas, fighting continued. A British cavalry captain from the Oxfordshire Hussars, southeast of Mons, wrote the following in his diary. At 11:15, it was deemed necessary to put out of action a German machine gunner in front of us who was still firing. The armistice was already in force, but there was no alternative. Perhaps his watch was wrong, but he was probably the last German killed in the war, a very unlucky individual. We must remember that just because the guns stopped firing, it did not mean that the losses would cease immediately. In other theaters of war around the world, fighting would continue for days, weeks, and even months, and on the Western Front, many men, wounded in those final days, would die in hospitals. Their families would receive the dreaded news, while their neighbors celebrated peace in the streets. There has always been power in the narrative of the last to fall. Surviving the carnage of one of history's most devastating wars, only to meet fate in the final moment, is deeply moving. And this account is especially poignant here, at the Saint Symphorien Military Cemetery, on the outskirts of Mons. In this tranquil setting, by a strange quirk of fate, we find Soldier John Parr, often considered the first British serviceman to fall in combat on the Western Front. Just ahead lies George Ellison, the last British soldier to fall. Two graves, separated by only 10 paces, yet carrying with them a million life stories. The cemetery's silence seems to whisper these tales as visitors contemplate the meaning behind these aligned tombs. Each headstone tells a part of the war saga, reminding us of life's fragility and the brutality of conflict. And amidst these graves, it becomes evident that fate often weaves an ironic plot, uniting the first and the last in a macabre dance of history and memory. Among the tombstones of Saint Symphorien Military Cemetery, the story continues, unfolding like a narrative with every step taken by visitors. The gravestones seem to tell their own tales as the sun casts a gentle light over the tranquil scene. People strolling through the cemetery feel a profound connection to the soldiers laid to rest there. Each headstone represents a unique fate, a life interrupted by the brutality of war. The names etched are more than just letters in stone. They are reminders of sacrifice and courage. The serene atmosphere of the cemetery contrasts with a sense of incompleteness hanging in the air. Visitors feel there is more to be uncovered, more stories to be told. They long to better know these men who gave their lives for peace. As the day progresses and the sun slowly sets on the horizon, the cemetery holds the secrets and memories of those who lie there. The story continues to resonate, passed down from generation to generation, keeping alive the remembrance of these heroes forgotten by time. As the day draws to a close, visitors pay their silent tributes and depart, carrying with them the stories and legacies of the soldiers who rest there. Meanwhile, the cemetery stands as a monument to courage and sacrifice, reminding all who pass through of the price of freedom. If you enjoyed this moving tale of wartime heroes, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to General Jack's channel to stay updated on more stories of wars. That way, you'll always be in the know and able to learn more about the events that shaped our world.